This story took shape through long hours of still research and deliberate concentration. Every detail has been placed here with purpose, to create a peaceful listening experience while handling these events with the weight and respect they deserve. What drives this channel is simple: to keep alive the cases that time and noise might otherwise swallow whole. There is a kind of evil that does not announce itself with chaos or spectacle. It does not arrive with warnings. It does not linger in the shadows long enough for you to sense it coming. It moves the way certain storms do, quietly gathering momentum far from where anyone is watching, until the moment it is directly above you, and by then it is already too late. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. This evening, we uncover 3 disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the quiet road to magazine. Now, let's begin. In the summer of 1977, a door was left unguarded. That is not a metaphor. It is a fact. A literal, physical door, the kind that swings open with a push. Left unwatched during a lunch break at a work site in McAlester, Oklahoma. 2 men noticed it. 2 men walked through it. And in the 2 weeks that followed, a trail of death stretched across 3 states, through rural towns and quiet roads and unmarked gravel pits, leaving behind a question that still does not have a fully satisfying answer. How does something like this begin with something as simple and ordinary as a forgotten door? The names Earl Van Denton and Paul Ruiz do not carry the cultural weight of some others you may have heard. They were not the subject of Hollywood films or major network specials. The towns they passed through were small. The victims they left behind were everyday people. A town marshal offering roadside help, a park ranger doing her rounds, a taxi driver, fishermen, a man leaning against a motorcycle on a Louisiana afternoon. None of them expected what was coming. None of them had reason to. What makes this story so quietly unsettling is not the violence itself, though the violence was real and the consequences devastating, but the sheer velocity of it. 14 days, multiple states, a widening arc of destruction moving westward and then east and then north, propelled by 2 men who seemed to carry within them a willingness to end lives without much deliberation at all. This is not a story about monsters from another world. It is a story about what happens when the systems designed to contain the worst of human behavior simply slip. When a door goes unwatched. When an overworked prison crew doesn't account for everyone at lunch. When small failures compound into something much larger and much harder to reverse. This is the story of Earl Van Denton, Paul Ruiz, and the 2 weeks in the summer of 1977 that changed the lives of everyone who survived them, and ended the lives of those who did not. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. To understand what happened in the summer of 1977, you have to first understand where it came from. Not the escape itself, but the years that preceded it. The choices made, the paths taken, the slow accumulation of decisions and circumstances that placed 2 men, Earl Van Denton and Paul Ruiz, together on a work crew in McAlester, Oklahoma, on a warm June morning, with nothing but opportunity between them and the open road. Earl Van Denton was born on December 13, 1949, in Oklahoma. He was, by the time of his escape, 27 years old. Slight in build, records describe him as 5 feet 7 inches tall and roughly 135 pounds. He was brown-haired and brown-eyed and, by all external appearances, unremarkable in the way that makes certain people dangerous. Not memorable. Not the kind of person you'd think twice about passing on the street. His criminal history, however, told a different story. By 1971, he had already been convicted of auto theft in Oklahoma, beginning a 10-year sentence. That was not the end of it. In 1970, even before that conviction was formally processed, Denton had been involved in the death of a man named William Willie Droke. The circumstances were not ambiguous. Droke was killed in a motel room, the result of a prolonged, brutal assault involving a bottle, a telephone receiver, and ultimately a shovel. There was nothing spontaneous or frenzied about it in the legal sense. It was deliberate. Denton and his associate at the time, a man named Paul Mayab, were convicted of first-degree murder on October 1, 1975. Both received life sentences. Paul Ruiz, born October 20, 1947, was 2 years older than Denton and arrived at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary by a different route. In July 1976, Ruiz robbed a liquor store in Custer County, Oklahoma, armed with a firearm. He was convicted and received a life sentence for robbery with a firearm, a sentence that might seem extreme to modern sensibilities but reflected the legal climate of the era, particularly in Oklahoma, where habitual offenders faced severe mandatory minimums. Ruiz was 29 years old when he escaped. His full background prior to the robbery is not comprehensively documented in public records, but what we know is that he was experienced enough in criminal behavior that a life sentence had not, apparently, generated any meaningful introspection. The Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester is one of the oldest prisons in the state. By the 1970s, it had a complicated institutional history, including a major and deadly riot in 1973, one of the most destructive prison riots in American history, that had left the facility damaged and the administration under pressure to rehabilitate and modernize. The riot, which lasted 3 days, resulted in the deaths of 3 inmates and the destruction of much of the prison's physical infrastructure. The years following were years of reconstruction, reorganization, and institutional vulnerability. Oversight was stretched. Resources were strained. The facility was, in short, an institution trying to find its footing again in the mid-1970s. It was into this environment that Denton and Ruiz were placed. And it was within this environment, still recovering, still reorganizing, that the conditions for escape were quietly, almost accidentally, created. On June 23, 1977, a work crew of 20 inmates was assigned to a demolition task at a brick factory near the prison. The work itself was physical and unremarkable, tearing down a structure that was no longer in use. When lunchtime arrived, the inmates were escorted into a nearby empty building to eat. The door to the building was not guarded. Whether this was a lapse in procedure, an oversight by an underprepared guard, or simply an assumption that the inmates were too supervised elsewhere to exploit the gap, the result was the same. The door was open. 2 guards were later demoted and suspended for their role in what followed, but the damage was already done. Ruiz, Denton, and a 3rd inmate named Elmer Finnan, who was serving his own life sentence for second-degree murder, walked out. Together, initially, the 3 then separated. Finnan eventually made his way to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he found work at a service station and lived quietly for 4 months before being caught and returned to prison on October 31, 1977. He would die in prison 4 years later, on October 21, 1981. Ruiz and Denton stayed together. That decision, to remain as a pair rather than disperse, would prove consequential in ways neither of them may have fully calculated. Alone, each man might have been more cautious, more inclined toward survival and concealment over confrontation. Together, there seemed to be a kind of compounding effect, a reinforcement of impulse, a shared willingness to escalate. The world they stepped into on June 23, 1977, was the American rural interior in the height of summer. Oklahoma in late June is hot and flat and vast. Small towns sit at intervals along state highways, connected by the logic of agriculture and commerce rather than density or proximity. These were communities where strangers were noticed but not necessarily stopped, where a man rolling a tire along the shoulder of the road might attract attention but also ordinary sympathy, where the systems of policing and communication were entirely dependent on human presence, radio calls, local knowledge, word of mouth, rather than surveillance infrastructure. It was a landscape that, in certain ways, favored 2 men who needed to move quickly and quietly and who understood, at least intuitively, how rural hospitality could be weaponized. The people who would encounter them in the days ahead did not know any of this. They knew only what the day in front of them seemed to offer. An ordinary afternoon, a routine patrol shift, a stretch of quiet highway. Marvin Ritchie was the town marshal of Magazine, Arkansas, a small community of a few hundred people tucked into the hills of Logan County. He was 42 years old. He knew the roads. He patrolled the way you can only know roads you have driven 1,000 times. Where the shoulders narrowed, where people sometimes broke down, which gravel turnoffs led to which properties. When he got word of two strangers rolling a flat tire along the road, he drove out to help. That was the kind of marshal he was. Opal Lee James was 58 years old and worked for the United States Army Corps of Engineers as a park ranger at Blue Mountain Lake. She and her colleague, 27-year-old David Small, managed the Ashley Recreation Area on the lake's shore. They were not law enforcement in the traditional sense. They were caretakers responsible for maintaining and monitoring a stretch of recreational waterway in the Arkansas hills. Small was young and newer to the job. James had been doing it long enough that it had become part of the rhythm of her life. Neither of them had any reason to believe June 29, 1977, would be different from any other day. Gerald Tiffy was 27 years old and lived in Boswell, Oklahoma. Jimmy Cockrells was 38. Alton Wilson was 66. Ray Jones was 65. James Melvin Short was 40. These were the other names. The ones who would come before, in the days between the escape and the Arkansas encounter. Each of them encountered Ruiz and Denton at a moment that could not have been predicted and could not, once underway, be reversed. The social and institutional context of all of this matters because it frames the conditions under which such a sequence of events becomes possible. The 1970s in rural America were years of institutional confidence, or perhaps institutional assumption. The idea that the walls of a penitentiary were sufficient, that a work crew of 20 men needed only a moderate level of oversight, that a lunch break in an unguarded building was an acceptable risk. These were not reckless ideas at the time. They were standard operating assumptions. And standard operating assumptions, when tested by the specific and determined intentions of men like Ruiz and Denton, can fail. That failure began with a door, and two men who noticed it was open. What unfolded after June 23, 1977, is not a story with a slow build. There was no extended period of hiding, no cautious weeks of laying low while the initial alarm subsided. Ruiz and Denton moved. They moved quickly, and they moved south. The first person believed to have crossed their path was Gerald Leon Tiffy, a 27-year-old from Boswell, Oklahoma. On June 27, 1977, 4 days after the escape, Tiffy simply disappeared. No witnesses, no final confirmed sighting. The circumstances of what happened to him have never been definitively established, and his body has never been found. In 1978, skeletal remains discovered in Texas were briefly believed to be Tiffy's, but forensic analysis confirmed they were not. He remains missing to this day. What is known is that after Tiffy's disappearance, Ruiz and Denton were in possession of his pickup truck. The truck mattered because it gave them mobility, and mobility in the geography of 1977's rural South was everything. On June 28, just 1 day after Tiffy vanished, the pair arrived in Louisiana. In Colfax, a small town in Grant Parish, the same parish that had been the site of one of the worst racial massacres in American history a century earlier, and which had never fully shaken the weight of its past. Ruiz and Denton encountered 38-year-old Jimmy Cockrells. By accounts available in the record, Cockrells was simply there, leaning on his motorcycle parked somewhere in town. The interaction, if it can be called that, was brief. He was shot and killed. His body was found on June 28th. On that same day, approximately 80 miles to the southeast near Franklinton, Louisiana, two fishermen, 66-year-old Alton Wilson and 65-year-old Ray Jones Sr., disappeared. Their bodies were not found for nearly 10 months, until April 29, 1978, when they were discovered submerged in a flooded gravel pit near Franklinton, hidden inside the cab of Gerald Tiffy's stolen pickup truck. The truck itself had been driven into the pit and left there. The bodies of Wilson and Jones showed no bullet wounds. Forensic analysis suggested that their deaths may have been caused by other means, though the exact manner was never conclusively established given the condition of the remains. The detail of the truck is important. By leaving the bodies of Wilson and Jones inside Tiffy's vehicle and disposing of it in the gravel pit, Ruiz and Denton created an inadvertent chain of evidence that would later connect their crimes across state lines, even though, at the time, no one yet knew what they were looking at. From Louisiana, the pair moved north into Arkansas. This movement back northward into the hills of Logan County is one of the more puzzling elements of the case from a strategic standpoint. They were fugitives. The rational move, from a pure survival perspective, might have been to continue south or southwest, toward the border and out of reach. Instead, they drove north. Whether they were running low on resources, whether they had a destination in mind, or whether the direction of their movement was simply opportunistic and reactive, remains unclear. What is clear is what happened next. On June 29, 1977, somewhere along the road leading out of Magazine, Arkansas, Ruiz and Denton had a flat tire. They removed the tire from the car, a stolen vehicle, and began rolling it along the road toward town to have it repaired. This is such an ordinary act, so thoroughly embedded in the mundane texture of daily life in a rural community, that it effectively became their cover. Two men rolling a tire down the road. A minor inconvenience. A reason to stop and offer help. Marvin Ritchie, the town marshal of Magazine, received a report about the two men and drove out to assist. This was his job. This was, by all accounts, the kind of thing he did as a matter of course. What followed happened quickly. Ritchie was seized. He was placed in handcuffs and put in the back seat of his own patrol car, which Ruiz and Denton then drove through Magazine and into the neighboring community of Blue Mountain. People saw them. Witnesses would later report seeing the patrol car pass through town with two unfamiliar men in the front and a man they recognized, Ritchie handcuffed, in the back seat. This was happening in plain view of a small community. People noticed. But the information did not translate into intervention quickly enough, because the car kept moving, and within minutes it was on the rural roads heading toward Blue Mountain Lake. At Ashley Recreation Area, on the shores of the lake, Park Rangers David Small and Opal Lee James were doing their jobs. They encountered the patrol car or were encountered by it, and were ordered at gunpoint into the vehicle. Small, 27 years old, and James, 58, were overpowered. The situation was controlled by Ruiz and Denton before it could be anything else. What happened in the wooded area where the patrol car came to a stop is documented in the trial record and in the subsequent testimony of David Small, who survived. Ritchie and Small were shot and placed in the trunk of the patrol car. Ritchie was shot in the head or neck and died. Small was shot in the chest but survived. A fact that later proved central to the prosecution's case, because Small lived to identify his attackers. Opal Lee James was taken separately, in the Ranger's truck, and her body was found inside that truck approximately 40 miles from Magazine. She had also been shot. The patrol car, with Small and Ritchie's bodies inside the trunk, was found at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon. The investigation began almost immediately, but it began without a full picture. Authorities knew that Ritchie was missing before the car was found. The witnesses who had seen the patrol car moving through town provided descriptions. But the two men, Ruiz and Denton, were not yet connected to the broader pattern of disappearances and deaths in Oklahoma and Louisiana. Each crime, in its respective jurisdiction, was being investigated in isolation. The gravel pit in Louisiana had not yet yielded its contents. Tiffy's disappearance in Oklahoma was still just a missing person report. What was known in Arkansas in the immediate aftermath of June 29th was this: a town marshal and a park ranger were dead. A second ranger had survived a shooting, and two unidentified men were moving somewhere in a stolen vehicle. The FBI joined the search. Authorities began tracing the connections between states. Governor David Pryor of Arkansas would, within weeks, be working to ensure that Arkansas had jurisdiction over the men if and when they were caught, a matter that would involve legal maneuvering across state lines, given that Oklahoma and Louisiana both had claims on the pair. On July 1st, 1977, a 40-year-old taxi driver named James Melvin Short was killed in Purcell, Oklahoma. His body was found 5 days later on July 6th in Chickasha. His taxi was stolen. It is suspected, though the connection was never charged in court, that Ruiz and Denton had looped back briefly into Oklahoma before continuing their northward and westward movement toward Oregon. They were found on July 8, 1977, in Portland, Oregon, 15 days after walking through an unguarded door in McAllister. 3 states, multiple victims, 1 surviving witness, and a trail of evidence that was still, in many places, being assembled. The arrest itself was not dramatic by the standards of what had preceded it. Portland was a long way from Magazine, Arkansas. Ruiz and Denton were with a third man, a hitchhiker named David Christopherson, whom they had picked up in eastern Oregon. Christopherson was questioned and released. He appeared to have been in the wrong vehicle at the wrong time, with no knowledge of what his 2 companions had done. The 2 fugitives were taken into custody. And then the long, slow machinery of American justice began to turn. When Paul Ruiz and Earl Van Denton were arrested in Portland, Oregon, on July 8, 1977, the immediate question was not whether they had committed crimes. The question was which state would try them first, and for which crimes. Oklahoma had a claim. Louisiana had a claim. Arkansas had a claim. Each jurisdiction had losses. Each had a legal interest in the outcome. Arkansas Governor David Pryor moved decisively. He initiated formal extradition proceedings, and an agreement was reached in August 1977 to return the men to Arkansas to face charges for the murders of Marvin Ritchie and Opal Lee James. The choice of Arkansas as the first jurisdiction was not arbitrary. Arkansas had a surviving witness. David Small, the young ranger who had been shot and left for dead in the trunk of Ritchie's patrol car, was alive. He had seen the men who attacked him. He could identify them. In the architecture of a capital murder case, that was significant. The pretrial period was not quiet. Arkansas was a small state, and Logan County, where Magazine sat, was a small community. The crimes had generated intense local coverage. Ritchie had been a known and respected figure in Magazine. James had been a fixture at Ashley Recreation Area. The murders were not abstract. They had faces that people recognized. Newspapers reported extensively on the case, and the grief of a community was visible and vocal. The defense would later argue, and the courts would ultimately agree, that this saturation of pretrial publicity had made it impossible for Ruiz and Denton to receive a fair trial in Logan County. But that legal battle was still ahead. For now, the preliminary work of justice was proceeding. The financial dimension of prosecuting 2 men on capital murder charges in a rural Arkansas county was also notable. Reporting in December 1977 estimated that the cost of the prosecution could reach between $100,000 and $500,000, a significant sum for a small county in the late 1970s. The state of Arkansas was, in effect, being asked to absorb an enormous financial burden as a consequence of an escape from an Oklahoma penitentiary. This created a particular kind of institutional tension that ran beneath the surface of the proceedings, rarely spoken aloud but present nonetheless. The trial began on April 17, 1978, before the Logan County Circuit Court in Boonville. The prosecutor was Paul X. Williams, Jr., who announced from the outset his intent to seek the death penalty. Under Arkansas law at the time, capital murder, the killing of a law enforcement officer, among other specific circumstances, carried a potential sentence of death or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial lasted approximately 10 days. On April 27, 1978, after 47 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts for both men on both counts. Then, after approximately 1 hour of further deliberation on the question of sentencing, the same jury unanimously imposed the death penalty. Judge David Pertain formally sentenced both Ruiz and Denton to death by the electric chair. An execution date of December 4, 1978 was set, though, as with all capital sentences in the United States at that time, the execution was automatically stayed pending mandatory appellate review. David Small's testimony was central to the prosecution's case. He had survived. He had been in the trunk of Ritchie's patrol car, wounded, for hours before the car was found and he was rescued. He had seen the men. In the courtroom, he identified them. His survival, a thing that easily could have been otherwise, became the linchpin of a case that sent 2 men to death row. The first round of appeals moved quickly through the Arkansas system. On June 4, 1979, the Arkansas Supreme Court overturned the death sentences. The reason was not the evidence or the conduct of the trial itself, but the method by which the jury had been selected. The court found that the process of death qualifying the jury, excluding potential jurors who expressed opposition to the death penalty, had resulted in a panel that was neither impartial nor representative of the broader community. It was a legal question with constitutional weight, and the court ruled in the defendant's favor on those grounds. Both men were retried. The change of venue to Morrilton in Conway County was granted for the retrial, specifically because the pretrial publicity in Logan County had been deemed prejudicial. The retrial, conducted in 1983, resulted in the same outcome. Both Ruiz and Denton were again convicted of capital murder. On October 3, 1979, the day after the retrial verdict, Conway County Circuit Court Judge Charles Eddy again sentenced both men to death, upon the jury's unanimous recommendation. A new execution date of June 3, 1980, was set. Again, it was stayed. For the people of Magazine, Arkansas, these legal proceedings were a particular kind of ordeal. To watch the convictions that had been achieved after such a costly and emotionally wrenching trial be overturned, even on procedural grounds, even for reasons that had nothing to do with the guilt of the men involved, was to experience the justice system in its most bureaucratic and frustrating dimension. The community was not wrong in its grief or its impatience. The legal system was not wrong in its requirements. But the two realities did not sit easily together, and the years that followed were, for many people in Magazine, a study in waiting. In January 1979, before the appellate process had fully run its course, Paul Ruiz participated in a large-scale escape attempt from the Cummins unit, the Arkansas facility where he and Denton were held on death row. 11 prisoners were involved. Ruiz was caught before he could clear the fence. Denton did not participate. The episode added a layer to the already complex picture of who these men were. For Ruiz, at least, the willingness to run had not dissipated. The appeals continued through the early 1980s. On June 8, 1981, the Arkansas Supreme Court dismissed appeals against the second death sentences. On November 30, 1981, the U.S. Supreme Court denied the follow-up appeals of both men. On July 18, 1983, the Arkansas Supreme Court rejected a third round of appeals. On January 31, 1985, however, the 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals allowed new appeals and remanded the case to the lower federal courts to review the death sentences, a development that opened yet another chapter in the prolonged legal battle. The question of Oklahoma's charges also hovered in the background throughout this period. Oklahoma authorities sought the extradition of Ruiz and Denton to stand trial for the murder of James Melvin Short. But the mechanics of capital litigation in Arkansas, combined with the sheer length of the appellate process, meant that by 1997, neither man had faced charges in Oklahoma for Short's death. The Louisiana victims, Cockrells, Wilson, and Jones, similarly never received the formal accounting of a trial. There is something quietly disturbing about this dimension of the case. The legal system prioritized its own jurisdiction first, as systems do. Arkansas tried them. Arkansas convicted them. Arkansas held them, and in doing so, effectively prevented the other states from ever having their formal accounting. The victims in Oklahoma and Louisiana received no verdict. Their families received no courtroom. In a narrow legal sense, those deaths existed only as background context to the Arkansas case, admissible as evidence of character and pattern, but never the subject of a verdict. For 20 years, Ruiz and Denton lived on death row. They filed appeals. They lost appeals. They filed more. The machinery turned slowly, and the community of Magazine waited. January 8, 1997. The date had been set and reset many times over the preceding 19 years. Each time an appeal succeeded, at least in part, the date shifted. Each time a court denied a petition, the clock moved forward again. By the final years of their lives on death row, both Earl Van Denton and Paul Ruiz had been through a legal process so prolonged that it had consumed most of their adult lives. Denton was 47 years old. Ruiz was 49. They had been in custody in one form or another for most of the years since their arrest in Portland, Oregon, in the summer of 1977. The world outside the Cummins unit had changed enormously in that time. The United States had cycled through 4 presidents. The Cold War had ended. Technology had transformed daily life in ways that would have been difficult to imagine in 1977. The small town of Magazine, Arkansas, had grown slightly, aged considerably, and carried the weight of its 1977 losses into a new era. The executions on January 8, 1997, were not performed alone. 3 men died at the Cummins unit that night, in what the New York Times described in a contemporaneous account as an evening of death. The 3rd man executed alongside Ruiz and Denton was Kurt Wainwright, who had been convicted of killing a police officer in 1989. All 3 were executed by lethal injection, the method that Arkansas had adopted in place of the electric chair, which had been the method specified in the original 1978 sentences. For the community of Magazine, and for the family of Marvin Ritchie and the family of Opal Lee James, the executions represented the conclusion of something that had taken almost exactly 20 years. 20 years of trials and retrials. 20 years of appeals and denials. 20 years of watching 2 men who had killed their loved ones continue to exist within the legal system, filing petitions and exhausting remedies and living, day after day, in a facility funded in part by the very state that had been devastated by their actions. Reporting from the time captured the complicated texture of what communities feel in these moments. There was relief. There was grief that does not simply dissolve because legal proceedings conclude. There was something that people called closure, though that word carries a weight that survivors often find inadequate. The idea that a death, even a legally sanctioned one, fully resolves the hole left by another death is one that those who have actually lived through it tend to approach with more nuance than the word suggests. David Small, the ranger who had survived being shot and left in the trunk of Ritchie's patrol car, was the witness who had made the prosecution possible. He was 27 in 1977. By 1997, he was 47. He had carried the events of June 29, 1977, through 2 decades of his life. What that means, in the interior sense, is not something the public record captures fully. What is documented is that he testified, that he identified the men who attacked him, and that his testimony held across 2 trials and nearly 2 decades of legal challenge. The case of Ruiz and Denton raises questions that extend beyond the specifics of their crimes and into broader territory. The first concerns the conditions of the escape itself. 2 guards were demoted and suspended for the failure of oversight that allowed 3 inmates, including 2 serving life sentences for murder and armed robbery, to walk through an unguarded door. 2 guards, demoted and suspended. In the accounting of consequence, that disproportion is striking. The failure was systemic as much as individual. The Oklahoma State Penitentiary in 1977 was still recovering from the devastation of its 1973 riot, still operating with depleted resources and institutional fragility. But the formal accountability rested largely on 2 individuals rather than on the broader conditions that made the lapse possible. The second question concerns the victims who never received a formal legal accounting. Gerald Tiffy's body has never been found. His family has lived for nearly 50 years without the closure of a confirmed answer. Jimmy Cockrell's, Ray Jones, and Alton Wilson were killed in Louisiana, but the state of Arkansas, as the jurisdiction that secured custody first, effectively preempted any Louisiana prosecution. James Melvin Short was killed in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma's effort to extradite Ruiz and Denton for his murder never succeeded before the men were executed. These are not academic points. They are human ones. The families of those victims did not have their day in court. Their losses were documented in case files and newspaper archives, but never adjudicated. The system did what it could within its structure, but its structure had limits, and those limits had human costs. The third question is the one that true crime, as a genre, tends to circle without fully landing on: what makes someone capable of the kind of behavior Ruiz and Denton demonstrated? This is not a question with a tidy answer, and this documentary will not pretend otherwise. Denton's history, the 1970 killing of Willie Droke, the auto theft, the specific brutality documented in the motel room in Oklahoma, suggests a pattern of violence that preceded the 1977 spree by years. His capacity for harm was not new. The Oklahoma State Penitentiary had been informed of it when they sentenced him to life. The escape did not create the violence. It released it into an environment where it could propagate. Ruiz's profile was somewhat different. His conviction was for robbery with a firearm, serious, but categorically distinct from Denton's history of direct physical violence. What the pairing of the two men produced was something that neither, perhaps, would have done alone, or at least not with the same velocity. This is a recognized phenomenon in criminal psychology. The amplification of antisocial behavior within certain dyadic partnerships, the mutual reinforcement of impulse and action that produces outcomes more extreme than either individual tendency might generate in isolation. The Ruiz-Denton pairing appears to be a clear example of this. Though no formal psychological assessment of the pair appears in the public record, the case also sits within a specific historical context regarding the death penalty in the United States. The Supreme Court's 1972 ruling in Furman v. Georgia had effectively halted all executions in the country, and the legal landscape around capital punishment was in a state of active reconstruction throughout the late 1970s. Arkansas was among the states that reinstated the death penalty after Gregg v. Georgia in 1976 permitted executions to resume under revised statutes. The Ruiz and Denton case was one of the first major capital trials in Arkansas under the new framework, and the legal challenges they mounted, particularly the successful challenge to death qualification of jurors, contributed to the evolving jurisprudence around capital proceedings. In this sense, the case left a mark on American legal history that is separate from, and in some ways more durable than, its place in true crime documentation. The arguments made by their defense attorneys about jury selection shaped subsequent rulings. The case became part of the legal infrastructure that governs how capital trials are conducted in the United States. For the small town of Magazine, Arkansas, the legacy is more personal and more local. The town is small enough that the loss of Marvin Ritchie in 1977 was not an abstraction. He was a neighbor. He was known. The manner of his death. Responding to what appeared to be a routine call for assistance, attempting to help two strangers with a flat tire, carries a particular weight because it happened in the context of an act of ordinary kindness. He drove out to help. That is what he did. And it cost him his life. Opal Lee James, 58 years old, working the grounds of a recreational lake on an Arkansas summer afternoon, is remembered similarly. She was not a combatant. She was not engaged in a confrontation. She was, in the most literal sense, just doing her job, on a day that gave her no warning. The story of Earl Van Denton and Paul Ruiz is not a story that offers easy moral resolution. The executions happened. The legal process, however prolonged and frustrating, produced an outcome that reflected the severity of what the men had done. But the victims who were never accounted for in court, the families who received no verdict, the community that waited 20 years. These are reminders that legal resolution and human resolution are not always the same thing, and that the gap between them can be profound. There are questions that remain. Tiffy's body has never been found. The precise manner of Wilson and Jones's deaths was never fully established. The full accounting of how many lives Ruiz and Denton affected, not just those they killed, but the survivors, the families, the communities, has never been formally totaled. What is totaled is incomplete, because trauma does not file paperwork. What we are left with, in the end, is this. Two men walked through an unguarded door on a June morning in 1977, and for 14 days they moved through the American landscape, leaving devastation behind them. They were caught. They were tried. Twice. They were convicted. Twice. They were executed, together, on the same night, nearly 20 years after the door swung open and nobody stopped them. The door mattered. The ordinary negligence of it mattered. The victims it made possible mattered. And the fact that even the most comprehensive legal process could not reach every corner of what they had done. That is the part that lingers long after the official record closes. Some silences, it turns out, are not closed by verdicts. They are simply learned to live with. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The story of Samuel Diedemann and Dale Hausner. Phoenix, Arizona, 2005 to 2006. There is a particular silence that settles over a city when it begins to understand that the danger is not hiding in the shadows. It is not lurking in alleyways or stalking any one type of person. The danger is riding slowly down an ordinary street, past corner stores and bus shelters and people just trying to get somewhere, past a woman walking home from work, past a man waiting for a bus, past a teenager on a bicycle. The danger has no face that the city recognizes, no grudge it can trace, no motive it can reason away at night. And that is the particular terror of what happened in Phoenix, Arizona, between the spring of 2005 and the late summer of 2006. Not the bloodshed itself, though there was plenty of it, but the complete absence of reason behind it. 8 people were shot to death. Dozens more were wounded. Animals were killed. Buildings were set on fire. And for more than 14 months, an entire metropolitan area of nearly 4 million people quietly, carefully began to change the way they moved through their own lives. They stopped taking evening walks. They drove when they used to walk. They hurried past windows. They watched the cars that slowed down. They did not talk about it much because there is a specific kind of fear that is too shapeless to describe easily, too ambient to point at clearly. It is not the fear of one bad neighborhood or one type of victim. It is the fear that it could be anyone, anywhere, at any hour, for absolutely no reason at all. That is the fear that Phoenix lived with. And at the center of it, quietly sharing an apartment in Mesa, were 2 men that nobody had thought to look for yet. 2 men who, by all visible evidence, were simply living ordinary lives. One worked at an airport. The other was an electrician. They went to bars. They watched the news. They followed the coverage of the very crimes they were committing, with what investigators would later describe as something very close to pride. What they had decided to do together was not born from rage or grief or ideology, or any of the frameworks that ordinarily help us understand why someone becomes dangerous. What they had decided to do, in the word one of them eventually used himself, was recreational. That word, once you hear it attached to what they did, does not leave you easily. It is not supposed to. Phoenix, Arizona, in the early 2000s was a city accelerating. It was expanding outward across the desert floor in every direction at once, annexing land faster than it could build the roads to cross it. The population was surging, drawn by warm winters, affordable housing, and the promise of a Western life uncomplicated by the density and history of older American cities. Strip malls had replaced citrus groves. Suburbs pressed against the Sonoran Desert in long, sun-bleached rows. People arrived from all over the country, often with thin roots and fresh starts, and they spread themselves across the valley in ways that made the place feel enormous and anonymous in equal measure. That anonymity, it turned out, was both the city's character and its vulnerability. The Valley of the Sun is what locals have always called it, and on the surface it earned the name. But beneath the warmth, Phoenix in 2005 was also a city quietly struggling with its own velocity. The infrastructure of community, the dense walkable neighborhoods, the corner stores, the longtime neighbors who knew each other by name, had been traded away for sprawl. People lived in their cars more than their yards. The sidewalks in some parts of the city were almost theoretical. Strips of concrete alongside 6-lane arterial roads where the heat shimmered off the asphalt and there was no shade to speak of. To walk in Phoenix was, in many parts of the city, to be conspicuous, isolated, exposed. That is where the story begins. Not with violence, not yet, but with geography. With the specific vulnerability of a city that had made walking feel lonely. Samuel John Diedemann was 30 years old in 2005, a man who had arrived in Arizona from Minnesota some years earlier carrying little but a history of minor trouble. Shoplifting charges, a drunk driving conviction, the small, grinding record of someone who had never quite found a stable footing. He was an electrician by trade, a detail that gave his life more structure than his habits might suggest, and he had settled into the kind of transient existence common to people who come to Phoenix in search of reinvention and find instead that they have simply moved their old problems to a hotter climate. He was not unknown to local law enforcement, though he was far from the kind of figure who drew serious attention. He blended easily into the city's enormous, shifting population of newcomers. Dale Sean Hausner was 33, and he was, by almost every available account, an unlikely candidate for the designation that would eventually be given to him. He worked a steady job as a custodian at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, a position he had held since 1999. He had a side interest in boxing journalism, contributing freelance work to outlets covering the fight game, taking photographs at matches, building a modest reputation in the sports peripheral media world. A few weeks before his arrest, he sat down and interviewed former heavyweight champion Mike Tyson for one of those outlets. Tyson, in a comment that would later feel almost cinematic in its unintentional irony, described Hausner as a small guy but a nice guy. People who worked with him at the airport said roughly the same thing. He was quiet. He was competent. He did not stand out. But Hausner's private history told a different story. He had been accused, in the past, of threatening a former wife with a shotgun. There were child neglect allegations in his record. And there was something else, a grief that legitimate tragedy had placed inside him. Both of his young sons had died in a terrible accident when his wife fell asleep at the wheel during a road trip and the car went into a river. Whatever internal architecture Hausner had maintained before that loss, and whatever had existed in its place since, was not visible to the people around him. What he showed the world was ordinary. What he carried beneath it was something that defied easy description. The two men became roommates in Mesa, a suburb immediately east of Phoenix that blurred seamlessly into the larger metropolitan fabric. Theirs was the kind of domestic arrangement common in a transient city. Two men sharing the cost of an apartment, sharing proximity without necessarily sharing much of anything meaningful. Except that they did share something. According to what would eventually emerge through court testimony, police investigation, and Diedemann's own words, they shared a habit. Methamphetamine was a presence in their lives, an accelerant to whatever impulses already existed. And they shared something harder to name, a specific, directed pleasure in causing harm to strangers for no reason that the law or psychology or ordinary human understanding could adequately reach. Diedemann later described what they did using a phrase that became one of the most chilling pieces of language associated with the entire case. He called it random recreational violence. Those three words, placed together, do something to the mind. Not gang violence, not robbery, not revenge, recreation. The word implies leisure. It implies a casual, voluntary pursuit of something enjoyable. It is not the word of someone who was afraid, or enraged, or acting under duress. It is the word of someone who had simply decided that certain people, random people, people chosen by proximity and nothing else, were available targets in a game with no rules and no referees. The city around them in the spring of 2005 was, in another dimension of horror, already generating fear of its own. The baseline killer, a separate offender who has since been identified and convicted as Mark Gutto, was also active in the Phoenix area at that time, committing sexual assaults and murders along the baseline road corridor on the south side of the city. Phoenix was quietly building its tolerance for a new kind of dread. Task forces were forming. The public was being warned. Community meetings were held in church halls and school auditoriums. And in the midst of that spreading unease, Hausner and Diedemann began their own campaign. The first shooting attributed to the serial shooters occurred in May of 2005. Tony Mendez was riding his bicycle in Phoenix when he was shot and killed. He was not targeted for any discernible reason. He was simply someone outdoors, visible, reachable. A few days later, Reginald Remillard was shot to death at a Phoenix bus stop. Both men were simply going about their lives in a city that had, without their knowledge, acquired two predators with no agenda beyond the act itself. For the next several months, the pattern would continue. Shootings at pedestrians, at people waiting for transit, at people walking through their neighborhoods on ordinary errands. Animals were shot as well. A horse was killed in late June of 2005, which would later become one of the investigative details that helped link incidents across jurisdictions and time. There was no apparent preference in the choice of victims. Age, race, sex, none of it seemed to determine who was chosen. What determined the choice was proximity, exposure, the bad luck of being outside and visible when the car rolled slowly past. What Phoenix did not yet know was that it was not living through a single threat. It was living through two simultaneous, independent ones, and it would be more than a year before anyone fully understood the shape of what was happening, or who exactly was responsible for it. By the time the calendar turned to 2006, Phoenix had developed a quiet, collective wariness that residents would later describe in the particular language of things that changed without any single clear announcement. Parents drove their children to bus stops they would have once let them walk to alone. Neighbors who had exchanged nods across the yard for years began to check more consciously on each other. The simple act of being outdoors after dark acquired a specific texture of hesitation that had not been there the summer before. None of this was announced. It accumulated. The Phoenix Police Department was, by this point, operating under considerable pressure. The baseline killer investigation had already consumed enormous resources and public attention. That case involved a perpetrator who targeted women along a specific geographic corridor, and it had generated a sustained, high-profile investigative effort that included community meetings, reward offers, and eventually the presence of citizen patrol groups on affected streets. The simultaneous emergence of what investigators were beginning to call the serial shooter complicated everything. Resources were stretched. The public sphere was being strained from two directions at once. And the investigative challenge of the serial shooter case carried its own specific difficulties. Because there were no survivors at many of the scenes who could offer useful descriptions. Because the attacks happened from a moving vehicle at night, on streets wide enough that the car was gone before witnesses could process what had happened. Because the victims had nothing in common except geography and the terrible accident of being outdoors at the wrong moment. There was no victimology to follow, no network of associations to map, no pattern of escalation toward a specific type of target. There was only a sequence of random encounters that ended in death or injury, and a city trying to understand something that resisted the structures of understanding. Investigators originally believed they were looking for a single offender. This is not an unusual initial assumption in cases where a pattern of similar crimes emerges. The default model in serial crime investigation is often to begin with a single actor until the evidence complicates that picture. In this case, the complication was significant. By mid-2006, detectives had begun to reconsider the scale of the incidents, the volume, the geographic range. These details pointed toward the possibility that more than one person was involved. It was a shift in perspective that would prove correct, but it arrived slowly, the way important investigative realizations often do. Through the first half of 2006, the violence continued and, in fact, intensified. May brought multiple additional shootings. A 17-year-old was wounded while walking in Phoenix. On May 2nd, Claudia Gutierrez Cruz, 20 years old, was shot and killed in Scottsdale while Hausner drove and Diedemann fired. She was simply walking. She was 20 years old. She had done nothing to draw attention to herself except exist in a public space. On June 8, 2006, Hausner and Diedemann added arson to the ledger of what they were doing together. They set fire to two Walmart stores in Glendale, Arizona, roughly 45 minutes apart. The fires caused an estimated $7 to $10 million in damage, and both stores were occupied at the time. The choice of targets, the timing, the deliberate quality of it, these were not impulsive acts. They were planned. There is a particular investigative challenge posed by criminals who function effectively in the ordinary world. Hausner was, during this same period, attending boxing events in his capacity as a freelance photojournalist. He was showing up for work at the airport. He was, by the available record, doing nothing that visibly marked him as a man engaged in a campaign of random murder on the streets of his own city. Diedemann, with his record of minor transgressions, was a more recognizable type of troubled person, but even he was not someone who had given law enforcement serious cause for focused attention. They were not hiding in any conventional sense. They were simply living the rest of their lives around the violence, which is, in retrospect, one of the most disquieting aspects of the entire case. June and July of 2006 brought still more shootings. Up to 11 additional people were wounded across the valley. The pace had accelerated. Detective Clark Schwarzkopf, who led the serial shooters investigation for the Phoenix Police Department, later described a dynamic that is difficult to dismiss once heard. He said that Hausner and Diedemann were, in their own distorted way, in competition with the baseline killer. The public attention given to that case, the task force, the community meetings, the press coverage, had generated a kind of notoriety that Hausner found appealing. He had told Diedemann, according to accounts that would surface during the investigation, that he wanted to become the best serial killer ever. That sentence does not parse like a human thought. It parses like an aspiration shaped by a mind that had thoroughly detached from any recognizable relationship with other people's lives. But it was real. And as the summer deepened and the other cases' profile grew, the serial shooters increased their frequency. Then, on July 30th, 2006, Robin Blasnek was shot and killed while walking at night in Mesa. She was 22 years old. Her death would be the last killing linked to the pair. It would also be the one that broke the case open. Ron Horton was an acquaintance of Samuel Diedemann. Not a close friend, perhaps, but someone in the orbit. Someone with enough proximity that Diedemann, in a moment of intoxicated loose-lipped excess, had said things out loud that should have stayed wherever impulses like his are supposed to stay. According to testimony that emerged during the investigation, Diedemann had talked while drinking about killing a woman. He had spoken in a way that left Horton uncertain whether he was serious, the kind of half-confession delivered with enough ambiguity that the listener can choose not to fully receive it. Horton had heard it, and for a time had let himself not quite know what it meant. Robin Blasnek's death changed that. Something about it, perhaps the age of the victim, perhaps the particular ordinariness of what she was doing when she was killed, perhaps the accumulated weight of months of uncertain knowledge, affected Horton deeply. He later said that her death had moved him quite a bit, and that he believed he might have prevented it had he gone to police earlier. He submitted a tip to Silent Witness, an anonymous crime reporting program used by Phoenix area law enforcement. He named Diedemann. That phone call, quiet and anonymous and arrived at too late and just in time, is the pivot on which the entire case turns. Meanwhile, surveillance footage from the Walmart arson had captured images of the suspects, and investigators had used that footage to begin building a visual profile of the people they were looking for. When Horton's tip arrived naming Diedemann, and when detectives connected Diedemann's description to the footage, something clicked into alignment. Investigators identified Diedemann from the surveillance video. They learned that he had a roommate. His roommate's name was Dale Hausner. On August 1st, 2006, Phoenix police observed Hausner dropping Diedemann off at a bar. They were driving a Toyota Camry. The Camry matched descriptions that witnesses at previous shooting scenes had offered. Investigators who had been working the case for more than a year were suddenly looking at something concrete. The feeling in that moment, as Detective Schwarzkopf later described it, was not exactly triumph. It was a careful, almost held-breath recognition. He said the hair on the back of his neck stood up when the vehicle pulled in. He took a breath and thought, "This is them." What followed was a surveillance operation that moved with precision. On August 2nd, police followed Hausner and Diedemann as they drove through several cities in the valley. On August 3rd, investigators were monitoring conversations between the two men, conversations in which, according to police accounts, Hausner and Diedemann were overheard boasting about certain killings and speaking about their victims with contempt. The two men, circling the city that they had terrorized for over a year, did not appear to understand that they were being watched. Or perhaps, by this point, some part of them did not care. During the surveillance, investigators retrieved a trash bag that Diedemann had left near a dumpster outside their apartment. Inside the bag was a map of the Phoenix Valley. Marked on it were locations near several of the shootings, and there was a piece of paper with a name written on it. The name was Robin Blasnek, the last victim, the young woman whose death had prompted Ron Horton to finally make that phone call. Her name, written on a piece of paper, carried away to a dumpster. The detail is almost too deliberate to absorb. A piece of paper linking the men to their final victim, discarded the same way one discards a grocery list or an old receipt. There is something in that detail about the way both men seem to move through their violence without the weight of it. No accumulation of guilt, no ritual of concealment, just a map and a name thrown away. Officers arrested both men outside their Mesa apartment on the evening of August 3, 2006. The arrest was made without significant incident. When police searched the apartment, what they found was both damning and revealing in a way that lingered. There were weapons. There were newspaper clippings about the serial shooter case, clippings that the men had apparently been collecting, following the coverage of their own crimes. There were videos. And investigators later established another detail that said something important about the psychology at work. Hausner and Diedemann had, on multiple occasions, returned to shooting scenes afterward as bystanders. They went back to watch, to stand in the small crowd of people who had gathered around the place where someone had just been shot, and to know something that nobody around them knew. The city responded to the arrests with a visible, collective exhale. Phoenix Mayor Phil Gordon stood before cameras and used language that was deliberately direct. There was relief in those words, but also something careful. An acknowledgement that the case was not yet fully resolved, that charges had to be filed and proved, that the law required the same careful procedure for these men that it required for anyone. What a significant portion of Phoenix felt, though, was that the shape of the fear had finally been given a name. On August 7th, Hausner held a press conference. This was a remarkable and strange decision. From behind whatever separation from reality had brought him to this point, he denied involvement in the shootings and attempted to redirect blame toward Diedemann. He presented himself as a victim of false association, a man whose only crime was having lived with the wrong roommate. It was a performance that most observers found difficult to take seriously, given what had already been found in the apartment they shared, and it did not generate the outcome he may have been hoping for. Diedemann took a different path. He spoke to police the night of the arrest, and he spoke at length. According to investigators and the accounts formalized in later legal proceedings, Diedemann told police that he and Hausner had taken turns shooting people from the car. He admitted that he had been the one to fire the shot that killed Claudia Gutierrez Cruz on May 2, 2006, while Hausner drove. He provided details. He gave the investigation what it needed, and in doing so, he had also, consciously or not, begun building the framework for the deal that would eventually define what remained of his life. The two men were charged with an extensive catalog of crimes. Hausner faced 88 separate felony charges across 5 indictments, including 8 counts of first-degree murder, 18 counts of attempted murder, 17 aggravated assaults, 26 counts of drive-by shooting, 10 counts of animal cruelty, and 2 counts of arson of an occupied structure. It was one of the most substantial charging documents in Arizona's criminal history. Diedemann's charges were narrowed somewhat by the cooperation he was prepared to offer, but he was still facing the full weight of what the state of Arizona believed he had done. There is a moment in nearly every criminal case of this magnitude where the people involved, the detectives, the prosecutors, the families of victims sitting in courtroom galleries, experience something that is difficult to articulate precisely. It is a kind of recalibration, an encounter with the reality of what human beings are capable of, not as abstraction or headline, but as a set of specific facts about specific people who had specific lives and who chose, repeatedly and deliberately, to end other specific lives for no reason that any available framework could fully explain. The serial shooter case produced that recalibration in Phoenix. Detective Schwarzkopf, who had spent more than a year inside the investigation, later wrote a book about the case. He titled it Random Recreational Violence, borrowing Diedemann's own phrase. In a city that had seen 2 serial killers operating simultaneously, that phrase remained the most troubling single piece of language to emerge from either investigation. It was not a diagnosis. It was not an explanation. It was a self-description. And it was, for anyone trying to understand what had happened, the most honest thing either man said. The legal proceedings that followed the August 2006 arrests took years to fully resolve, as major criminal trials often do. Samuel Diedemann entered into a plea agreement in April of 2008. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. In exchange, he agreed to testify against Dale Hausner at trial. The agreement meant he would face a life sentence rather than death. It was a calculation, his cooperation for his life, and it was one that prosecutors accepted because his testimony was valuable, and because the case against Hausner was, in any event, overwhelming on its own terms. In January of 2009, Diedemann took the stand and testified. He described what he and Hausner had done together in the plain, detailed language of a man who had decided that his survival now depended on the completeness of his account. He told the court that he and Hausner had driven around the valley and randomly chosen people to shoot. He admitted to his own role in Claudia Gutierrez Cruz's death. He provided the kind of interior narration of the crimes that the trial required. Not just what happened, but the quality of intention behind it, the deliberateness, the nature of the partnership between the two men. His testimony was, by most accounts, effective. It was also, for the families of the victims sitting in the courtroom, among the most devastating things they would ever hear. Dale Hausner's trial was one of the largest in Arizona's history by the measure of its charges. On March 13, 2009, the jury returned its verdicts. Hausner was found guilty of 6 of the 8 murder charges, and guilty on 74 additional counts across the range of charges he faced, 80 total convictions out of the 88 he faced. He was acquitted of 2 murders, the killings of Tony Mendez and Reginald Remillard, the first 2 victims attributed to the serial shooter, where the evidence was apparently insufficient to reach the beyond reasonable doubt threshold required by law. The sentencing followed. Dale Hausner received 6 death sentences, along with consecutive life terms and an additional 364 years in prison. The sentences were, in the symbolic vocabulary of American criminal punishment, a statement of finality, an attempt by the law to give the city a measure of formal closure. Whether sentencing of that scale accomplishes what it is meant to accomplish, for survivors, for families, for the broader community, is a question without a clean answer. What it accomplished, practically, was the permanent removal of Hausner from the possibility of any future freedom. Samuel Diedemann received his life sentence without the possibility of parole. As of available records, he remains incarcerated within the Arizona Department of Corrections. There are no further legal proceedings expected in his case. His life, as defined by the legal system, is the space of that institution for whatever time he has remaining. Dale Hausner did not serve his full sentence on death row. On June 19, 2013, he was found unresponsive in his cell at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. The cause of death was determined to be amitriptyline intoxication, an overdose of antidepressants he had accumulated. He had been on death row for roughly 4 years. The manner of his death was ruled a suicide. It was, in a case already defined by the absence of explanations, one more absence. The possibility of any final formal accounting, any public reckoning in which the full weight of what he had done could be officially laid before him by the state of Arizona. He was gone before that could happen. The families of his victims had to absorb that, too. For the families of the 8 people killed, the legal resolution brought whatever it is that legal resolution brings to people in that position, which is not always what they hoped or expected or needed. The law has its own vocabulary of finality that does not always align with the human one. Verdicts and sentences close chapters in the formal record. They do not close what the survivors carry. The families of the victims had, by the time of the trial, already lived with the aftermath of random, purposeless death for several years. They had lived with the particular grief of losing someone in a way that offered no rational framework. No reason to trace, no relationship to account for, no narrative that made the loss legible. Claudia Gutierrez Cruz was 20 years old. Robin Blasnek was 22. These were not abstractions. They were people with futures that were simply cut off on ordinary evenings by men who found the act of cutting them off to be, in the words they chose themselves, recreational. The broader sociological aftermath of the case is embedded in Phoenix's memory in ways that are difficult to quantify but real. The case is taught and discussed in law enforcement contexts as an example of the specific investigative challenges posed by truly random violence. Crimes with no victimology, no target pattern, no motive accessible through standard criminal profiling methods. It is studied as a case where two separate serial investigations ran simultaneously in the same city, straining resources and public trust in equal measure. And it is cited in conversations about the limits of conventional criminological frameworks, the models built on the assumption that there is, somewhere, a why that investigation can eventually reach. In the serial shooter case, the why that emerged was not a why in any satisfying sense. The men enjoyed it. That is the full extent of the available explanation. They had access to a vehicle and a weapon and a city full of people who walked, and they found the act of shooting those people from a moving car to be pleasurable. The methamphetamine may have lowered inhibitions or heightened whatever appetites were already present. The competitive awareness of the baseline killer's public profile may have added a strange external motivation. But neither of those factors created the underlying willingness. The underlying willingness was already there, waiting for circumstances to shape it into action. Detective Schwarzkopf, who spent years inside this case, described the experience of trying to build a criminal profile of the serial shooter as the most disorienting investigation of his career, specifically because there was no emotional logic to follow. Most violent crime, even very serious violent crime, has some emotional architecture that investigators can use as a framework. Anger, jealousy, greed. Even the most disturbed offenders tend to have some internal logic that connects them to their victims in some traceable way. The serial shooters had none. They chose by proximity, by availability, by the accident of someone being visible from a car window at the wrong moment on the wrong street. What Phoenix rebuilt in the years that followed was not so much a changed city as a city that had absorbed a particular knowledge about itself. About the limits of what safety can mean in a large, anonymous, sprawling urban environment. About the way ordinary life and extraordinary danger can exist simultaneously in the same space without any visible seam between them. Hausner was interviewing Mike Tyson. Diedemann was working as an electrician. They were moving through the ordinary routines of modern urban life, and then they were driving slowly past bus stops and shooting people, and then they were going back to watch. The victims deserved to be remembered by their names. Tony Mendez, who was riding a bicycle. Reginald Remillard, who was waiting at a bus stop. David Estrada, killed while going about his day in Tolleson. Nathaniel Schaffner, Marco Carrillo, Robin Blasnek, 22 years old, walking at night in Mesa, whose death finally moved Ron Horton to make the call that ended the spree. Claudia Gutierrez Cruz, 20 years old, in Scottsdale, killed while Diedemann shot and Hausner drove, and both men treated the act as something they were simply entitled to do. These names are the weight of the case. The legal record is the framework, but the names are the substance. There remain questions that no trial fully answered. How many additional incidents may have occurred that were never conclusively linked to the pair? What the long arc of Hausner's psychology looked like, from the devastating loss of his sons through the years of violence to the death row cell in Florence. What exactly passed between the two men in the apartment in Mesa on the nights when they were not driving and shooting, what the ordinary texture of that cohabitation looked like, how they talked about what they were doing, whether they talked about it at all. These are questions the surviving record does not fully answer, and that Hausner's death in 2013 closed off permanently. Samuel Diedemann, alive in a prison in Arizona, is the only person who holds whatever remains of those answers. He has not spoken publicly in any meaningful way since his plea agreement and testimony. The institution that contains him does not produce confessions or revelations on demand. What the case leaves behind, in the end, is what the families and the city have had to live with from the very beginning. The profound, disorienting absence of reason. The knowledge that on an ordinary evening, on an ordinary street, in the warmth of an Arizona summer, the wrong people could simply decide that you were available, and that there was, and is, no principle by which that selection could have been anticipated, predicted, or prevented. Only eventually investigated. Only eventually stopped. Phoenix has continued to grow since 2006, spreading further across the desert in every direction. The streets where the shootings happened are still there. The bus stops, the sidewalks beside the arterial roads. People walk them every day, most of them without any particular knowledge of what happened there in 2005 and 2006. History settles into cities in layers, and eventually the most recent layer is all that most people see. But underneath, in the places where memory persists, in the files of the investigators who worked those cases, in the lives of the survivors, and in the lives of those who lost someone they loved to a random car on a random street, the summer of fear is still present, still unreasonable, still, in the only sense that matters, unexplained. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Diary and the Darkness, the Wesley Allen Dodd Case. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a neighborhood when children stop playing outside. Parents notice it first. It creeps in without announcement. The yards go quiet, the bicycles stay in garages, and the sound of laughter on summer evenings slowly gives way to something else. Something that isn't quite fear, not yet. More like a held breath, a waiting. In the autumn of 1989, the neighborhoods surrounding Vancouver, Washington, fell into exactly that kind of silence. And what is strangest about the story you are about to hear is not the darkness of what happened there. What is strangest is how long the darkness had been building, quietly, patiently, invisibly, in the most ordinary-looking corners of ordinary American life. A man lived in a modest apartment not far from the parks where children played. He went to work every day. He kept to himself. He did not raise his voice or start fights or draw the attention of his neighbors in any way that might be remembered. He was, by most accounts, unremarkable. And in the evenings, after work, he sat at a small desk and opened a diary. He wrote in that diary the way some people write grocery lists. Methodically, practically, without flinching. He recorded things he had done and things he intended to do. He wrote about children. Children he had seen in the park, children he had followed, children whose names he sometimes knew and sometimes did not. He wrote about what he wanted to do to them, and in the pages that followed the autumn of 1989, he wrote about what he had actually done. The diary was found by police on November 13, 1989, inside the apartment of a 28-year-old man named Wesley Allen Dodd. By that point, 3 children were already dead. And by that point, the diary had grown thick with entries, going back not weeks, not months, but years. This is a story about the slow failure of every system that was supposed to stop what happened. It is about a man who told people, police, counselors, judges, courts, exactly what he was and exactly what he was capable of, sometimes almost word for word. And it is about the question that lingers long after the final sentence of this story has been read. Not who Wesley Allen Dodd was, but how, for 15 years, so many people chose not to fully hear him. What follows is not a story about a monster who appeared without warning. It is a story about warnings that appeared without consequence. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling truth of all. To understand Wesley Allen Dodd, you have to begin not in Vancouver, Washington, in the autumn of 1989, but further back. In the dry, flat terrain of eastern Washington state, in a mid-century American town called Richland, where a boy grew up in the kind of quiet that can swallow a child whole if no one is paying attention. Dodd was born on July 3, 1961, in Toppenish, Washington, a small agricultural community in the Yakima Valley, the eldest of 3 children born to James and Carol Dodd. The family eventually settled in Richland, a planned city that had grown out of the World War II-era Hanford site, where much of the plutonium for the Manhattan Project had been processed. Richland was, in the post-war decades, a community of engineers and government workers and young families. Tidy, suburban, unremarkable in all the ways that American cities of that era aspired to be. The Dodd household was not a happy one. James Dodd worked as a milkman and later in dairy manufacturing. Carol Dodd worked as a dishwasher. By most accounts, the marriage was strained, marked by frequent arguments and a chronic emotional distance that their children could not help but absorb. Wesley, as the eldest, occupied a peculiar position in the family hierarchy. He was not, by his own account, physically abused in any dramatic or decisive sense. What he described instead was something quieter and perhaps more corrosive: the consistent absence of warmth. In interviews conducted before his execution, Dodd stated plainly that he had no memory of either parent ever saying the words, "I love you," to him. He could not remember saying them either. His father, James, acknowledged his son's increasingly troubling behavior over the years with what he described as father-son chats. He told an Oregon newspaper that Wesley was otherwise a well-behaved child, that he never drank, never used drugs, never got into the kinds of fights or disturbances that might have signaled something was wrong in the conventional sense. This, perhaps, was part of the problem. The conventional signals were not there. What was there, quietly, was something else entirely. In grade school, Wesley was described by his brother Gregory as small, pigeon-toed, and bookish. He was picked on by classmates. He was not athletic. He struggled to connect with peers his own age and seemed more comfortable around younger children, who were less intimidating, less judgmental, less capable of the casual cruelty that defines schoolyard hierarchies. He played clarinet in the junior high marching band. He was active in the drama club, eventually becoming vice president of the Thespians. He had, by some accounts, a genuine rapport with younger students. But in private, something was already shifting. When Wesley was approximately 13 years old, around 1974 or 1975, he began exposing himself to children in his Richland neighborhood. At first, it was from the upstairs window of his parents' home. Later, he graduated to riding his bicycle around the neighborhood, approaching younger children directly. Police came to the house on at least one occasion. Nothing of legal consequence followed. His father acknowledged the behavior but treated it as something to manage privately rather than something that demanded systemic intervention. In the years that followed, the behavior escalated in ways that would become grimly familiar to anyone who has studied the pattern of predatory offending. Dodd was not yet accessing strangers. He was, in the manner of many who begin this way, moving outward from the circle of people he already knew. By the time he entered high school, he had molested his younger cousins, children aged 6 and 8. He had abused the children of a neighbor whose family he had befriended and offered to babysit. He had molested the daughter of a woman his father was dating. He was arrested at 15 for indecent exposure. Police released him with a recommendation for juvenile counseling. It is worth pausing here to absorb that sentence. He was 15. He had been offending for at least 2 years. He had moved from exhibitionism to hands-on molestation. And the system's response was a recommendation. Not a requirement. A recommendation. James Dodd's parents divorced in May 1976, when Wesley was 14. For many adolescents, parental divorce is destabilizing but ultimately navigable. For Wesley, the dissolution of his already fragile family structure seemed to accelerate a process already well underway. He became, by his own description and those of people who knew him, more withdrawn, more isolated, more interior. In that interior world, the fantasies were growing. He later told the officer who interviewed him following his 1989 arrest, a conversation that has since become one of the most clinically illuminating in the forensic record of this case, that by his early teens he had begun to understand that he was most strongly attracted to boys, though he would continue to offend against girls as well. He was not processing this through any framework of adolescent confusion or sexual discovery. He was, even then, approaching it with something closer to clinical precision. He knew what he wanted. He thought about how to get it. He wrote things down. The diary habit, which would ultimately be his undoing, began early. Dodd kept personal records of his offenses and his desires in a manner that was at once deeply self-aware and entirely without remorse. Psychologists who later evaluated him identified this documentation not as evidence of guilt, but as a kind of trophy system. The records existed alongside clippings, photographs, and other physical artifacts he accumulated over the years. They were, in his own psychological architecture, proof of what he had done. Evidence of his own existence in the only domain where he felt powerful. In August 1981, at the age of 20, Dodd attempted to abduct 2 young girls. They reported him. No action was taken by authorities. The following month, He enlisted in the United States Navy and was assigned to the submarine base in Bangor, Washington. One might wonder what he was thinking when he signed enlistment papers, whether the Navy represented, in some part of his mind, an escape from the compulsions that had already woven themselves into the fabric of his daily life. If so, the escape lasted almost no time at all. At the Bangor base, Dodd began abusing children who lived in the base community. In one documented incident, he offered a group of boys $50 to accompany him to a motel room for a game of strip poker. When arrested, he openly told police he had intended to molest the boys. Charges were ultimately not filed. He was arrested again shortly afterward for exposing himself to a boy and was dishonorably discharged from the Navy. He served 19 days in jail. He was ordered to undergo counseling. He went to counseling. He continued to offend. In May 1984, he was arrested for molesting a 10-year-old boy. He received a suspended sentence. He moved between Washington State and Idaho, leaving a thin trail of reports and arrests and court appearances that, taken individually, seemed manageable, isolated, even. A counselor named Steve Lindsley, who worked with Dodd in 1983, following a guilty plea to a molestation charge in Richland, described him as appearing open and communicative in sessions while giving every professional indication that treatment was unlikely to succeed. Lindsley identified Dodd as what clinicians call a fixated offender, someone whose sexual interest was fundamentally and exclusively oriented toward children, specifically boys aged 10 to 12. Dodd's emotional development, Lindsley noted, appeared arrested at roughly that same age. He related to children not as an adult relates to a child, but as a child of that age might relate to a peer. After 2 months, Dodd dropped out of treatment. He almost immediately began offending again. The courts intervened repeatedly. The sentences remained short. The counseling continued to be recommended, attended briefly, and abandoned. By 1986, according to the Encyclopedia of Murder and Violent Crime, Dodd had sexually assaulted at least 30 children. He had begun, by that year, to have explicit fantasies about killing his victims. He was 25 years old. He had been reported to police, arrested, charged, sentenced, and released repeatedly for more than a decade. In 1987, working as a security guard, he attempted to lure an 8-year-old boy into a vacant building. The boy sensed danger, went home, and told his mother, who contacted police. Prosecutors recommended 5 years in prison given Dodd's documented history. The judge, noting that Dodd had not physically touched or exposed himself to the child, placed him on probation and ordered psychiatric treatment. He served the probation. He finished it. He stopped going to treatment. And in 1989, Wesley Allen Dodd moved to Vancouver, Washington, where he found a job as a shipping clerk and rented a modest apartment in a building that housed families with children. He had chosen it deliberately. He was 28 years old. He was, by his own later admission, done with the constraints he had spent more than a decade navigating. The fantasies had metastasized into plans. The plans had become intentions. And the intentions, in the late summer of 1989, were about to become something that no amount of counseling recommendations could undo. Vancouver, Washington, in 1989 was a city in transition. Positioned directly across the Columbia River from Portland, Oregon, it was neither suburban sprawl nor urban core, but something in between. A working-class community with tree-lined parks, modest neighborhoods, and the kind of easy geographic openness that families appreciate without fully thinking about what that openness might also mean. David Douglas Park was one of those places. A large, heavily wooded expanse with secluded trails and quiet pockets of greenery. It was the kind of park where families brought their children on weekday afternoons, and where children sometimes wandered on their own. It was not a dangerous park in the conventional sense. It was simply a park. And in the late summer of 1989, Wesley Allen Dodd had identified it as a place where he was likely to find children alone. He had come to Vancouver with a plan. Not a vague set of intentions, but an actual operational plan, the kind that speaks to both premeditation and the cold efficiency of someone who has been thinking about this for a very long time. He had brought tools with him when he went to the park. A fish fillet knife and shoelaces to use as restraints. He had been to the park on scouting visits before September 4th. He knew what he was looking for and roughly where to look. On that day, Labor Day weekend, September 4th, 1989, 11-year-old Cole Neer and his 10-year-old brother William were in David Douglas Park. The boys were playing, as children do in late summer when school is almost back in session and the warmth of the season still offers a reprieve. They were, by the ordinary logic of childhood, doing nothing unusual. Dodd encountered them on one of the park's more secluded trails. What followed was recorded in Dodd's diary in clinical, dispassionate detail. He lured the boys into a more isolated area of the park, threatened them, forced them to undress, and tied them to a tree. He sexually assaulted both brothers. When he was finished, he stabbed them repeatedly with the fillet knife and fled the scene. The boys were discovered relatively quickly. Cole Neer died at the scene. William Neer was alive when found and was rushed to hospital, where he also died from his injuries. They were buried within days of each other. Their family's grief was absolute and private and has remained largely out of public record, which is as it should be. What entered the public record was the investigation. A search that would take investigators into territory they had not mapped and toward answers that, when they finally came, would raise as many questions as they resolved. Law enforcement in the Vancouver area and Clark County had a murder case. 2 victims. A heavily wooded crime scene that had not preserved physical evidence cleanly. No witnesses. No clear suspect. The investigation began moving through the standard channels, canvassing forensics, neighborhood interviews. Dr. Ronald Turco, a forensic psychiatrist called upon to assist in the investigation, produced a psychological profile of the likely offender. The profile described someone aged 25 to 35, probably discharged or removed from the military, a loner who likely kept photographs of victims, maintained a diary of his offenses and collected news clippings, and who had chosen boys as targets because, in Turco's analysis, he perceived girls as psychologically less accessible to his control. The profile was, in retrospect, a remarkably accurate description of Wesley Allen Dodd. But profiles are only useful when there is a suspect to attach them to, and at this stage of the investigation, Dodd had not surfaced. He was living quietly in his apartment, going to work and writing in his diary. He wrote about the Neer brothers. He described what he had done and reflected on what had gone differently than planned. He noted what he would do differently next time. And then, with a coldness that is difficult to process even across the decades, he began planning the next time. Less than 6 weeks after the murders of Cole and William Neer, on October 29, 1989, Dodd drove across the Columbia River into Portland, Oregon. He went to Richmond Elementary School, where a 4-year-old boy named Lee Aselli was playing alone on the playground after school hours. Lee's family, his mother, Claire Nyland, and his stepfather, had allowed him brief outdoor time while they were nearby. In the ordinary logic of an ordinary Sunday afternoon, nothing about the situation was supposed to be dangerous. Dodd approached Lee Aselli on the playground. He told the boy that he was a friend of Lee's father. He told him they were going to go find a lost toy. Lee, 4 years old and trusting in the way that 4-year-olds are, went with him. Dodd drove Lee across the state line, back to his apartment in Vancouver, Washington. He kept the boy overnight. He recorded everything in his diary. What he did, what Lee said, how Lee behaved, what he felt. At one point, according to the diary entries that investigators would later read in full, he woke the sleeping child to tell him what was going to happen in the morning. The specificity of that cruelty, the deliberateness of it, is something that has stayed with everyone who studied this case. He wanted the child to know. In the morning, Dodd strangled Lee Aselli. He then suspended the boy's body in a small closet and took photographs. He wrapped the body in trash bags and drove to a wooded area near Vancouver Lake, where he concealed it. He burned Lee's clothing in a trash barrel. He kept one item, the boy's small underwear, decorated with the Ghostbusters logo, in a briefcase beneath his bed, alongside the photographs. Lee Aselli's body was discovered 3 days later. The community had already been shaken by the deaths of the Neer brothers 6 weeks prior. Now there was a third child, a 4-year-old, taken from a Portland school playground and found dead across the state line. The investigation, already under pressure, intensified sharply. The Portland Police Bureau and the Clark County Sheriff's Office were now coordinating across state lines. The FBI was involved. The media had begun covering the case extensively, and the coverage had the particular quality it often takes on when children are involved: a rising, sustained frequency of alarm. Parents across the Portland-Vancouver metro area were pulling children inside. Schools held assemblies. The language of predator and danger entered daily life in a way that is hard to fully convey to anyone who has not lived through a period of community-wide fear for children's safety. In the neighborhoods closest to the parks and schools where these events had occurred, the silence that had been settling for weeks became something heavier. And all the while, Wesley Allen Dodd remained under the radar. He went to work. He stayed mostly in his apartment. He wrote in his diary about future plans, about the improvements he intended to make to his methods, about the children he had been watching, about a homemade device he had been constructing in his apartment that he intended to use on his next victim. He was, by his own written account, not frightened by the investigation. He was, if anything, more focused. The arrest, when it came not through the meticulous work of the investigation, but through the courage and quick instincts of a 6-year-old boy and a quick-thinking theater employee. On November 13, 1989, Dodd drove approximately 12 miles east of Vancouver to the town of Camas, Washington. He went to the New Liberty Theater where a family film, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, was showing. He went into the restroom, where he found a 6-year-old boy named James Kirk II. He attempted to abduct James, picking him up and moving toward an exit. James Kirk began screaming and fighting. A theater employee named William Ray Graves heard the commotion and moved toward it. Graves, a man who later described acting entirely on instinct, grabbed Dodd by the neck and pulled him back into the lobby. He restrained Dodd there, using a belt to tie his hands, while others called police. Dodd sat on the floor of the theater lobby and stared at the ground and said nothing. James Kirk's mother had, in the weeks since the murders of the Near boys and Leah Selly, drilled her children on exactly what to do if anyone tried to grab them. She had taught them to scream, kick, fight, and make noise. James Kirk did all of those things, and because he did, he went home. When police arrived at the theater and took Dodd into custody, the initial charge was attempted kidnapping. But when they brought him in for questioning and ran his name through the system, the picture began to shift rapidly. Dodd was cooperative with investigators in a way that surprised them, not defensive, not evasive, but forthcoming. He told them about the murders. He told them about Leah Selly. He told them about the Near brothers. He answered questions fully. And then the officers went to his apartment and found the diary. What they found in that apartment: the diary, the photographs, the briefcase with its terrible contents, the constructed device, constituted one of the most comprehensive self-documented records of predatory offending that investigators in the Pacific Northwest had ever encountered. It did not leave much room for legal ambiguity. Wesley Allen Dodd was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted kidnapping. He was 28 years old. There are trials that hinge on evidence, trials that hinge on argument, and trials that hinge on the performance of doubt, the slow, careful excavation of uncertainty that the adversarial legal system requires. The case of Wesley Allen Dodd was none of those things. From the moment of his arrest, Dodd had made clear that he intended to cooperate fully with prosecutors and that he had no interest in mounting a defense that might cloud the facts of what he had done. He pleaded guilty to all charges in January 1990. 3 counts of first-degree murder, the attempted kidnapping of James Kirk II. He waived his right to a jury trial on the question of sentencing and appeared before the court to speak on his own behalf, not in mitigation, but in something closer to its opposite. What Dodd told the court during sentencing was unusual enough that it became, in the months and years that followed, a document studied by legal scholars, criminologists, and death penalty advocates on both sides of the debate. He told the judge that he could not control his urges. He said that if he were given any opportunity to escape, he would take it, and that if he escaped he would kill and rape again. He was explicit about this. He was not performing despair or making a calculated legal argument. He appeared, by every account of those present, to be stating what he understood to be a factual reality about his own psychology. In a court affidavit filed in 1991, Dodd wrote that each time he had entered treatment, he had continued to offend. He wrote that he had liked what he was doing and had done everything necessary to avoid incarceration so that he could continue. The directness of that statement, its utter absence of the mitigation and narrative that most defendants construct around their worst acts, was something that defense attorneys, journalists, and psychologists continued to grapple with for years. The sentencing judge gave Dodd the death penalty, and then something happened that was, in its own way, as legally significant as anything that had preceded it. Dodd refused his automatic appeal. In Washington state, as in most states with capital punishment, death sentences come with mandatory review processes designed to ensure that the legal system has not made an error. These reviews exist not because the condemned is entitled to freedom, but because the state has an interest in not executing people based on flawed process. They are structural. They are, in theory, not optional. Dodd's attorneys and legal scholars debated heatedly whether a defendant could waive such protections over his own objections, or, in this case, at his own insistence. Dodd wrote directly to the Washington State Supreme Court urging them to allow him to forego his appeals and proceed to execution. He wrote letters. He gave interviews. He stated his case in legal filings drafted with his attorney's reluctant assistance. His argument was not complex. He deserved to die for what he had done. He would kill again if given any opportunity to do so, and the system's interest in procedural review was outweighed by what he framed as a moral and practical urgency. He wanted to be executed before he could harm anyone else. Debates inside and outside the courtroom were fierce. Death penalty opponents argued that allowing Dodd to choose his own execution was closer to state-assisted suicide than to justice. Some worried that granting a condemned man his preference, especially one as high-profile as Dodd, set a troubling precedent. Others, including some who opposed capital punishment in principle, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of conceding that Dodd's self-assessment might be accurate. Psychologists who evaluated him confirmed that his prognosis for any form of behavioral change was, in clinical terms, essentially nil. The Washington State Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, ruled that Dodd did in fact have the right to waive his remaining appeals. The ruling drew national attention and generated commentary from legal scholars, criminologists, and advocacy organizations across the country. It was, in the landscape of death penalty jurisprudence, a genuinely unusual outcome. In the interim, the years between conviction and execution, Dodd did something else that drew attention, and that has remained, in its own strange way, one of the most discussed elements of the entire case. He wrote a pamphlet. The pamphlet was titled, "When You Meet a Stranger," and was directed at parents and children. It was, in essence, a guide to avoiding child predators, written from the perspective of someone who had spent years being one. Dodd wrote about the tactics predators use, the ways they build trust, the environments where they look for victims, the methods by which they neutralize a child's natural alarm.